What if I told you that the greatest threat to your freedom, your future, your family, and even your soul, and by extension, the real force destroying the world, is not evil? Not violence, not greed, not corruption, but stupidity. Not the kind you laugh at, not the silly kind, but the dangerous kind. The kind that doesn't look like stupidity at all. The kind that smiles, nods, and obeys, without thinking, without asking, without questioning why. Not the kind of stupidity we joke about, but a quiet, contagious, socially accepted kind of stupidity that grows in systems, infects crowds, and slowly erodes the moral fabric of humanity until reason, truth, and even courage become irrelevant. This isn't a joke. This is a warning, because one man, a pastor, a theologian, a resistance fighter, discovered something terrifying about the nature of human evil, and he paid for that discovery with his life. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and his final warning to humanity wasn't about dictators. It was about you and me. He gave us a theory of stupidity so terrifying, it was never meant for casual discussion. Because once you hear it, you can't unsee it. In politics, in culture, in your workplace, and most disturbingly, in yourself. This isn't just about IQ. It's about the collapse of independent thinking. What happens when we stop thinking for ourselves? And if you're not careful, you might already be part of it. Let's begin. Who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Let me give you a little history about him and why he's most relevant in our discussion today. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't your typical preacher. He was a German theologian born in 1906, brilliant from a young age. While other young men were preparing for war or chasing comfort, Bonhoeffer was reading Nietzsche, writing books on ethics, and questioning the soul of his own nation. When Hitler rose to power, many churches in Germany bowed down. They wrapped the cross in a swastika. They preached obedience to the state as obedience to God. But Bonhoeffer didn't flinch. He joined the resistance. He helped Jews escape. And while imprisoned in 1943, just months before he was executed by the Nazis for plotting to overthrow Hitler, he wrote something few people ever truly understood. He didn't say the world was being destroyed by hate. He didn't even blame evil men. He blamed stupidity. He said, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice." More dangerous than evil? That sounds absurd until you look closer. Bonhoeffer had witnessed the rise of the Third Reich firsthand. He watched ordinary church-going, seemingly decent people turn a blind eye to genocide, propaganda, and cruelty, not because they were evil, but because they were incapable of thinking clearly in the grip of mass ideology. You see, the evil person knows what they're doing. They can be confronted, argued with, exposed. But the stupid person? They're not thinking for themselves. They're just repeating. Blindly trusting, operating on borrowed convictions they've never examined. And that makes them untouchable. Let's get one thing straight. Bonhoeffer wasn't mocking intelligence. This wasn't a sarcastic jab at people who get things wrong or score low on an IQ test. He wasn't saying stupid people are dumb. He was saying something far more terrifying. Stupidity is a moral condition, not an intellectual one. It's not about your ability to solve math problems or memorize facts. It's about whether you've surrendered your ability to think independently. Think about that for a moment. A person can hold a PhD, read the New York Times, and speak 5 languages, and still be stupid in Bonhoeffer's sense. Why? Because once a person forfeits their inner compass, once they outsource truth to the crowd, to a party, to a guru, or to an algorithm, they've opened themselves up to something far more dangerous than ignorance. They've become infected with what Bonhoeffer called defensive stupidity. In his own words, "Against stupidity we are defenseless. Neither protests nor force can touch it. Reasoning is of no use." That should send a chill down your spine. It means once someone's mental guard is down, no truth can reach them. Not even with love, not even with logic. You can show them evidence, history, real-life consequences, and nothing changes. Not because they don't understand, but because they've disconnected their understanding from their identity. And that is the critical difference. You see, the stupid person isn't evaluating reality through truth. They're evaluating reality through tribe. They don't ask, "Is this right?" They ask, "Will I be accepted if I believe this? Will I be safe? Will I be liked? That's the trap. And in that moment, the moment you replace critical thought with social approval, you stop being a sovereign mind and become a vessel for someone else's will. That's not an insult. That's a warning. Stupidity in this context isn't just a lack of insight. It's the rejection of responsibility. It's willful blindness. It's when you say, I don't want to think for myself, just tell me what to believe. And in a world flooded with influences, narratives, and mass media manipulation, that kind of stupidity becomes not only common, but comfortable. Because it relieves you of the burden of thinking. You don't have to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. You don't have to challenge your own biases. You don't have to risk rejection. All you have to do is nod and repeat. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because stupid isn't passive. It spreads. It becomes contagious. Not through malice, but through convenience. Not through wickedness, but through the ease of fitting in. And before you realize it, you can live your whole life parroting ideologies, defending opinions you never chose, and rejecting people you've never met. All because you didn't want to think. That's the death of the individual. That's the breeding ground for tyranny. And that's what Bonhoeffer saw in Nazi Germany. A generation of good, obedient, non-critical citizens who handed over their conscience in exchange for belonging. Not evil, but stupid. And the scariest part? They didn't even know it, because once stupidity takes root, you're no longer aware of your own blindness. You're sure you're right, even when you're not. You feel righteous, even when you're complicit. And you become proud of the very chains that keep you small. This is what makes Bonhoeffer's theory not just uncomfortable, but existentially threatening. Because if stupidity is not a lack of intelligence, but the abdication of responsibility, then the only cure is courage. The courage to think for yourself. The courage to risk isolation. The courage to say, I don't know if that's true. Let me think about it. And the terrifying truth? Most people would rather be wrong than be alone. So they stay stupid. Here's where it gets worse. Stupidity, according to Bonhoeffer, is not an individual defect. It's not something you're born with. It's not just a personal shortcoming. It grows in groups. It feeds on crowds like a virus feeds on warm bodies. In solitude, Bonhoeffer writes, a person may retain their intelligence, but as soon as they become part of a group, they lose their capacity for reflection. And that's the gut punch. It's not your IQ that dissolves. It's your inner authority. Because the moment you step into a crowd, whether it's physical or digital, the rules change. You stop asking, what's true? And start asking, what's safe to say? What gets applause? What won't get me attacked? That's where the rot begins. Because crowds don't reward truth. They reward obedience. They reward conformity. Think about it. When was the last time someone stood up in a group and questioned the popular opinion and got thanked for it? More likely they got shamed, shunned, mocked. So what do most people do? They comply. They stay quiet when something feels wrong. They repost the popular take even if it's empty. They laugh when the group laughs, even if it feels off. They go along to get along. And slowly, inch by inch, their integrity erodes. Their discernment dulls. Their voice fades. Until eventually, they don't know what they believe anymore. They don't know what thoughts are theirs. What values are inherited. What ideas are just tribal slogans in disguise. And that's the scary part. Because once you don't know what you believe, you'll believe anything. And once you forget why you believe something, you'll defend it without thinking. You'll rage on behalf of ideas you never questioned. You'll shame others in the name of virtues you've never examined. You'll become, as Bonhoeffer warned, an instrument, no longer a human being. Because stupidity doesn't just multiply in groups. It metastasizes. It becomes culture, policy, mob. It creeps into classrooms where children are taught what to think, but not how to think. It hides in corporate mission statements that sound noble, but mean nothing. It sits behind the glowing screen as millions scroll, tap, share, but never stop. And here's the part that should terrify you. Once stupidity becomes collective, it becomes invisible. It doesn't look like madness. It looks like normal. It looks like polite silence when someone says something absurd. It looks like empty slogans and outrage du jour. It looks like virtue that costs nothing and truth that offends no one. And if you dare to ask real questions, you're the problem. You're the outsider. You're the dangerous one. And suddenly, it's not just stupidity we're up against. It's the fear of thinking. The fear of losing our place in the hive. The fear of being awake in a world that demands sleep. This is why Bonhoeffer's theory still cuts so deep. Not because it insults others, but because it confronts something in us. That uncomfortable, aching awareness. We've all been there. We've all chosen silence over truth. We've all nodded along to things that didn't feel right. We've all laughed with the group instead of listening to our gut. Not because we're evil, but because we're afraid. Because crowds offer comfort, and truth does not. And that is what Bonhoeffer feared most. Not stupidity as a flaw, but stupidity as a refuge, a hiding place for the masses, a soft, numb shelter from the burden of moral clarity. Because when nobody thinks, nobody is responsible, and when nobody is responsible, anything becomes possible, even atrocity. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Up until now, you've probably been thinking about them, the masses, the media, the politicians, the loud influencers, the neighbor who posts conspiracy theories, the co-worker who parrots headlines like gospel. But Bonhoeffer didn't write this theory for them. He wrote it for us. For the person in the mirror. Because the terrifying truth is, stupidity is not just around you. It can live inside you. And the moment you assume you're immune, you're already infected. So let me give it to you straight. Here are the practical warning signs that you may be slipping, quietly, invisibly, into the very stupidity Bonhoeffer warned about. You get emotional when someone disagrees with you, but you can't explain why. You don't know your reasons, you only know your reactions. You speak more in slogans than in real thought. Phrases like, "It is what it is," "That's just how things are," "It's not that deep," become your shield from complexity. You mock opposing views without understanding them. You ridicule what you never studied. You shame what you never tried to comprehend. You laugh, not because it's funny, but because everyone else is laughing. You trust what aligns with your identity, more than what aligns with logic. If your group believes it, so do you. If your tribe supports it, so must you. Not because it's true, but because it's yours. You avoid hard questions. You avoid people who ask them. You say you're protecting your peace, but sometimes that peace is just avoidance dressed as self-care. You follow the crowd, not because you believe them, but because you're tired of standing alone. Because let's be honest, truth can be lonely, and silence in a sea of noise is its own kind of suffering. And here's the most dangerous sign of all. You stop asking questions, not because the answers are clear, but because the questions make you uncomfortable. You stop wondering if you're wrong. You stop digging into your own contradictions. You stop listening for the whisper that says, there's more to this. Because when the mind becomes lazy, the soul becomes blind. And that blindness doesn't look like darkness. It looks like pride. It looks like certainty. It looks like safety. But it's a coffin. It buries your curiosity. It buries your integrity. It buries your capacity to think for yourself. And slowly, day by day, you stop being a person and start becoming an echo, not a voice. Not a mind, just a hollow repetition of whatever happens to be loudest, most accepted, or least inconvenient. That's how it starts. Not with malice, not with stupidity in the cartoonish sense, but with surrender. The slow, subtle surrender of your mental independence, traded for acceptance, comfort, and illusion. That's why this theory is terrifying, because it doesn't live in the extremes. It lives in the everyday. It lives in the small moments when you choose silence over honesty, agreement over curiosity, repetition over reflection, and you never even notice it until you've forgotten what your own voice sounds like. Let's be honest. We've all been there, not just once or twice, but in small, repeated moments that quietly shape our character. We've nodded along in conversations we didn't agree with, because we didn't want to be the difficult one. We've laughed at things we didn't find funny, because silence would have made us stand out. We've reposted headlines we didn't research. We've agreed with group opinions we barely understood. And we've stayed quiet when something deep inside screamed, "This isn't right." Not because we're evil, but because we were scared. Scared to lose approval. Scared to seem foolish. Scared to be alone. And so, without even noticing, we traded truth for tribe. We became echoes. We confused being accepted with being wise. We thought certainty made someone right. We thought repetition meant something was real. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we stopped asking questions. Because questions cause friction. Questions slow things down. Questions challenge authority, disturb the group, upset the algorithm. So we learned to stay safe. And in doing so, we became stupid. Not in intellect, but in conscience. That's what Bonhoeffer meant. Stupidity isn't just about the brain. It's about the soul that's too afraid to think for itself. And that realization stings, because if we're honest, we feel the weight of our own cowardice. We remember the moment we silenced ourselves. We remember watching something unfold and saying nothing. We remember the fake agreement, the uncomfortable nod, the times we betrayed our own values just to avoid awkwardness. That's the ache of moral regret, not for what we did to others, but for what we allowed to be done through us. And that shame, that ache, it isn't punishment. It's a gift. It's the soul's way of saying, you were meant for more than this. Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't an indictment to make us feel helpless. It was a mirror, held up to show us what happens when we let our inner compass rust. Because when enough people give away their conscience, when truth becomes optional, when thinking becomes dangerous, the unthinkable becomes normal. And that's not philosophy. It's history. Millions died because entire societies stopped thinking. Good people, educated people, people who believed in God, in morality, in decency. But in the presence of collective stupidity, they became silent cogs in a horrific machine. And we'd be foolish to think it can't happen again. Because it's already happening, just in more polite disguises, disguised as trends, as virtue signaling, as unquestioned ideologies, disguised as loyalty to systems that don't care about truth, only control. And if we're not vigilant, if we don't reclaim our ability to think, reflect, and wrestle with discomfort, then we're not as free as we think we are. We're just well-trained. That's the terrifying truth. And it leaves us with a haunting question. How much of what we believe is actually ours? So how do you escape it? How do you keep your mind sharp in a world that rewards dullness? How do you build an inner compass strong enough to resist the winds of mass opinion? Because the terrifying truth is this: stupidity is not a permanent condition. It's a choice, a habit, a gradual decay of courage. But so is clarity, so is integrity, and so is freedom. Here's how you reclaim it, step by deliberate step. 1. Reclaim your sovereignty of thought. The first act of liberation begins in silence. Before you retweet, repost, or repeat something, pause. Ask yourself, is this mine? Or did someone hand it to me? We live in a world flooded with borrowed beliefs. Everyone has an opinion, but very few have earned it. And most people don't think, they echo. Every emotionally reactive opinion you adopt without reflection weakens your ability to think for yourself. So when you feel yourself getting triggered, outraged, or instantly aligned with a narrative, ask, do I actually know this, or am I being programmed? Because sovereignty of thought is not being contrarian. It's being responsible. It's refusing to let your mind be rented out by the mob. 2. Love truth more than validation. Most people don't want the truth. They want to be seen as right. But truth is rarely flattering. It doesn't care how you feel. It doesn't care about your politics, your identity, or your tribe. It simply is. And the moment you love truth more than validation, you become dangerous to stupidity. You become someone who can't be manipulated by applause, who can't be bought with likes, who doesn't change their mind just because it's trending. Bonhoeffer risked his life, not to be right, but to be true, and that cost him everything. The question is, what would you be willing to lose to stay honest? 3. Stay intellectually humble. One of the greatest protections against stupidity is humility. Not the kind where you fake modesty, oh, I don't know anything, but the kind where you stay curious, where you realize what I believe today might be wrong tomorrow, and I'm okay with that. Because the moment you think you've arrived at the final truth, you stop listening, you stop growing, and you start preaching. Intellectual arrogance is the breeding ground for stupidity, because when you refuse to question your own thinking, you outsource the process of thought. True strength isn't in certainty, it's in flexibility, the ability to revise, to evolve, to change when truth demands it. So ask yourself often, what am I missing? What don't I want to admit? That's where your growth lives. 4. Spend time in solitude. Solitude isn't loneliness, it's oxygen for the soul. Bonhoeffer understood this intimately. In prison, he found more clarity than most people find in freedom because solitude strips away the noise. When you're alone, you confront your thoughts. You discover what you really believe. And most importantly, you stop performing. Because in the crowd, we perform. We say what's acceptable. We think what's safe. We lose the voice inside, but in silence, the fog clears. You remember who you were before the world told you who to be. If you want to build an anti-fragile mind, you need regular intervals of stillness, time with books, time in nature, time with your own questions. Because a distracted mind is a dumbed-down mind. 5. Resist easy answers. Stupidity is lazy. It wants a single cause, a single enemy, a single cure, and that's why it loves slogans. But life is not a bumper sticker. The moment you settle for simple narratives, you become a puppet. Easy answers are seductive because they relieve us of the burden of thinking. But wisdom lives in complexity. It lives in nuance, in paradox, in the ability to hold conflicting truths in tension. It's much easier to say, they're evil, we're good, than to ask, what's really happening beneath the surface? Resist the temptation to flatten reality. Instead, lean into the discomfort of not knowing. Learn to say, it's complicated with humility, not defensiveness. Because when you resist easy answers, you begin to reclaim your mind from the machinery of mass manipulation. 6. Choose truth over comfort, even if it costs you. This is where most people fall. They know what's true, but they don't want to be the only one saying it. They stay quiet at work. They say nothing at dinner. They go along to get along, and in doing so they become complicit in a culture of stupidity. Bonhoeffer wrote, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." The same is true for mental cowardice. Not to question is to obey. Not to think is to submit. So if you want to be free, if you want to stay awake, you must be willing to stand alone. You must become the person who says, "I'd rather lose friends than lose my mind. I'd rather walk away from the crowd than betray my soul. I'd rather be hated for thinking than applauded for parroting." Because the final protection against stupidity isn't intellect. It's integrity. It's the courage to stand in truth, even when that truth is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or isolating. And that, more than any fact or quote or argument, is what keeps your mind alive. Bonhoeffer was executed in April 1945 by direct order of Heinrich Himmler, one of the most cold-blooded men of the Nazi regime. He was hanged in the Flossenburg concentration camp, naked, humiliated, body broken, just days before the camp was liberated by Allied forces. He died not as a soldier with a weapon in his hand, but as a witness. A man who chose to resist the darkest collective impulse of his time with nothing but his words, his mind, and his conscience. And yet, despite the blood-stained pages of history screaming at us to remember, what he warned us about has never left. It didn't die in a bunker with Hitler, it evolved. It put on a suit, logged into the internet, bought a microphone, built a brand. It became subtle, sophisticated, entertaining. It became trends that go unquestioned. It became ideologies people parrot before they even understand what they mean. It became a society so addicted to speed, comfort, and belonging that thinking slowly, deeply, and courageously is now seen as suspicious or even dangerous. Today, mass stupidity no longer looks like goose-stepping in the streets. It looks like the blind repost, the mindless outrage, the cancel mob that doesn't think, only strikes. The political tribalism that doesn't ask what's true, but only who said it. It looks like fear masquerading as virtue. And because we've confused loudness for leadership, we follow. Because we've mistaken confidence for truth, we obey. Because we've outsourced our discernment to influences, institutions, and algorithms, we no longer know what we believe. And here's the terrifying part Bonhoeffer saw coming. You don't need a dictatorship to produce mass stupidity. You only need people willing to trade their personal responsibility for collective safety. You see, stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's eyes, wasn't an individual insult. It was a systemic failure of moral courage. The moment we become afraid of thinking for ourselves, The moment we hand over our convictions to political teams, religious institutions, or media idols. The moment we choose to belong over being honest, we become clay in the hands of anyone willing to shape us. And here's where it gets even more terrifying. You won't know it's happening. You'll feel informed, enlightened, empowered. You'll speak with confidence and moral superiority while parroting the thoughts of others. And you'll reject any voice that threatens your adopted worldview, not with logic, but with contempt. Bonhoeffer saw this not just in Germany, but in human nature itself. This wasn't a Nazi problem, it was a psychological virus, and it mutates in every generation. And it doesn't need evil men to spread it. It just needs good people to stop thinking. So now, I want you to stop and ask the questions most people never dare to face. What beliefs do I hold that I've never questioned? What assumptions feel safe because they were handed to me by people I like, trust, or agree with? What group do I fear being cast out from if I dared to say, I'm not sure I believe that anymore? What memes, ideologies, and slogans have I repeated? Not because I understood them, but because they made me feel like I belonged. And most hauntingly, have I become the kind of person Bonhoeffer was trying to save the world from? Because that is the real horror. Not that evil exists, but that we could participate in it with good intentions, simply because we chose not to think. Bonhoeffer never wanted us to wage war on the stupid. He wanted us to look in the mirror. Because it's easy to demonize others. It's easy to say, that side is brainwashed. That group is the problem. That politician is dangerous. But the real battle is not out there. It's in here. In your mind, your heart, your willingness to examine your own assumptions. To remain free in your thinking, even when it costs you friends, comfort, or certainty. Bonhoeffer believed stupidity wasn't a disease of the intellect. It was the refusal to take moral responsibility for your mind. And if we lose that, we lose everything.